My name is Bob Pasnow. I'm a professor of philosophy here and the director of the Center for Western Civilization, Thought and Policy. Let me tell you a little bit about Colleen before we get started. She is a professor of political science at Villanova University and the director of the Matthew Ryan Center there. She received her PhD in 1986 from the Claremont Graduate School. She's the author of 3 books. Most recently, in 2015, from Cambridge University Press, she published The Mind of James Madison, The Legacy of Classical Republicanism. In 2009, she published another book with Cambridge entitled James Madison and the Spirit of Republican Self-Government. And then back in 1998, she co-authored with Gary McDowell a book entitled Friends of the Constitution, Writings of the Other Federalists. She's also got 2 books in progress. At least that's what it says online. Is that true? Yeah, the notion of a book in progress can be a bit vague sometimes with scholars, but she's co-editing the Cambridge Companion to the Federalists, and she's also working on a book entitled The Education of Emma Woodhouse, which is part of her long-term interest in the writings of Jane Austen, which is pretty interesting. She's somebody I've been talking to for a number of years now about the possibility that she might spend a year at Boulder as one of our visiting scholars, and this trip is part of her checking us out, and we're checking her out, and we're hoping that this can be made to work sometime before too long, because we'd love to have her here for the year. But tonight she'll be talking about civic friendship in America. So let me turn things over to Colleen.
Thank you very much, Bob. Can everyone hear me? Is this on? Yes, it works in progress, or at least in process, right? I want to thank Dr. Pasnow for inviting me here and for his gracious hospitality. And Alex Thompson-Holgren, thanks so much. You've been fabulous. And Laura, it's good to see you again. And also special thanks to Provost Russell Moore, who is a solid, strong supporter of the center that Dr. Pasnow heads up here, which I think is incredibly important to save liberal education today, whether you're on the left or the right, the study of the human things. If we can get an education these days without studying the human things, I'm not sure if that's really fully a liberal arts education. So thanks for doing that here. And just one correction, I'm co-director this year, that's because you didn't know that, of the Ryan Center, because Jack Duty, my husband, has been roped into directing 2 centers at Villanova this year. So I want to thank Jack especially for that help. Here's a quotation from Aristotle's Politics that I wanted to start with. It is thought to be the special business of the political art to produce friendship. Now, we don't usually think about politics that way today, do we? But there was a time that politics was thought about that way, and it wasn't just in the thought of Aristotle, but I found that kind of idea expressed in the founding of our own country. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit this evening. As was the case in the 1790s, the 1860s, the 1920s, and the 1960s, today at nearly the 2020 mark, once again, politics is the great divider in our society, outstripping divisions and antagonisms grounded in race, ethnicity, religion, sex, economics, and social status. A recent study by Stanford professor Shianto Iyengar and others concludes that in America and other Western democracies, people identify more along partisan lines than they do according to gender, race, ethnicity, language, or religion. But just as they identify and bond more on the basis of partisan views, they also divide more fervently along these same lines, thus contributing to the increasing political polarization in European and American societies today. Another recent study conducted by the Pew Research Center found that not only are partisan divides stronger than ever before, but even more alarmingly, a high number of respondents viewed their partisan opponents as a threat to the common good. 27% of Democrats polled reported this sentiment, while 36% of Republicans did. In one respect, these partisan sentiments would seem to be a good thing. It makes sense to find common ground with others who share ideas, rather than simply identify on the basis of race, ethnicity, or sex, characteristics we don't choose. After all, the American polity was the first political order founded on an idea rather than on some particular attribute that set a group or people apart from others. America was the first time a nation was founded not on the basis of some special attribute of a particular people, but on the basis of what we share with all human beings everywhere. But today, Americans do not share the grounding idea that animated the revolutionary and founding generation. If that central idea was that all men are created equal, as Lincoln contended, then today, as in 1860, we are again at loggerheads over that idea, over who we are and what we stand for as a people. As in the mid-19th century, both sides speak the same language of equality and liberty, but they define these principles in vastly different terms. The difference, perhaps immeasurable difference, in the definition of these principles is due, I think, to the fundamentally different ways each side understands what it means to be human. What are the implications of these markedly dissimilar, even rival conceptions of humanity that fuel the contemporary house divided? Can we as a nation survive by pursuing a live and let live philosophy, at least on the most discordant issues? Take the case of the Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission, for example. Can the two sides find a way to agree to disagree? If there is a way somehow, just let everyone eat cake? Or what about the recent legislation in Utah that aims both to recognize and protect marriage rights of the LGBT, but also allows claims of religious exemptions? Is this a compromise that should serve as a model for the rest of the states? Or what about Roe versus Wade and the abortion debate, which has been a focus of the recent confirmation hearings, as you well know, on Judge Kavanaugh? Is there a way to agree to disagree on this issue? According to liberal commentator Sally Kohn in her new book entitled The Opposite of Hate, a field guide to restoring our humanity, not only incivility, but hate and cruelty are becoming all too common in our politics and culture today. Our national motto, she said, is E pluribus unum, out of many, one. It's an ideal, if not always a reality, but represents the intended spirit of America, that we come together in spite of our differences, not ignoring them. The problem, Kohn believes, is not in our political disagreements. In fact, she says, and I quote, our different opinions and identities should be celebrated, unquote. Rather, the problem is in how we express our differences and how we treat those with whom we disagree, as though, she says, quote, they're inherently evil. She continues, and I quote her at some length. She says this, part of the reason I'm a progressive is that I believe that in our interactions as people and in our public policies, we should recognize the full equality and equal dignity of all human beings. And so since the 2016 election, I've been dismayed by the surge of anti-immigrant sentiment, Islamophobia, and other forms of hate that I believe have been explicitly stoked by Donald Trump through both his campaign and his presidency. And yet I've also watched as my fellow progressives have hurled ugly smears about those who voted for Trump, saying that Trump supporters are deliberately and even inherently hateful. And that's why my progressive friends, and she puts this in italics, hate them. And she continues, I don't hate Trump supporters and I don't hate conservatives in general. I disagree in large part with their solutions to what ails our nation, but I don't think they're bad people who, by and large, mean to do harm to me or our country. And it's up to me to convey my disagreements with conservatives in a way that is still fundamentally respectful and kind. Plus, to remember that, as important as our differences and disagreements are, we all still have so much in common, unquote. Now, and these are my words, The question which Cone raises and answers, but which I want to raise and keep open as a question for the moment, is this. Can a nation composed of citizens who disagree so deeply about what is right and wrong, just and unjust, endure? Can it survive? Do citizens of a Republican polity have to share in a fundamental common cause, bound together by some fundamental principles? Do we, in a foundational sense at least, have to be united by the bonds of civic friendship? In a word, does a nation have to be composed of citizens who constitute, in a decisive respect, one people? Now, civic friendship is an old notion, prominently featured in the writings of the Greek political philosophers. So I'd like to just give us a little background about where this came from and how the classics thought about it. According to Aristotle, what makes a polity one is its constitution, but I say that as a small c constitution. That is, the form that orders the citizens by way of a certain education, set of laws, and conception of justice. What Aristotle meant by constitution is analogous to a form that orders matters. What makes up or constitutes or organizes the political order. What sets the tone, if you will, like a key of a musical piece sets the tone literally and character of its composition. What for Aristotle constitutes a political order is then, I think, akin to what Tocqueville would later call habits of the mind, habits of the heart. In Tocqueville's view, in popular governments, what the people think and believe, what they cherish and what they denigrate, set the character of political life in the nation. In Federalist 39, Publius called this notion the genius of the people of America, claiming that the genius of the American people requires that the form and general aspect of their government be strictly Republican. And I say that Republican with a small r, meaning representative democracy or kind of popular government. And republic is, of course, the word that the Greeks use in a generic sense that means polity, or it can mean also a popular government. The Constitution, capital C, Constitution of the United States, as a document, and the government as an institutional matter, takes its cue from the mind and moral character that constitute the genius of the American people. So the Constitution that we usually think of, the written Constitution of 1787 with all its amendments, is parchment. It's words, words, words. But what gives it, what animates it, what gives it life, what really gives it meaning, has something to do with what's beneath it, what's underneath it, what constitutes that political order in the most fundamental sense that has to do with the people. It's not just systems. There are people behind these systems who believe in certain things, who cherish certain things, who love certain things. And that in the fundamental analysis, it seemed to Aristotle, and I sort of buy into this, is the Constitution, small c, the regime, in the most fundamental, the most decisive sense. Just as a constitution sets the tone and character of the political order, that which holds a polity together is civic friendship. For the ancient political philosophers, all cities are associations of families and individuals who hold something in common, and that which they hold in common forms the basis of their civic friendship. Civic friendship, or the bonds between citizens that hold things together, like the glue, is not identical to the kind of friendship that exists in families or between good friends. Not the same thing. Neither is it merely akin to the loose bonds of utility that connect individuals, groups, or cities on the basis of security or self-interest, whether political or economic. Those of you who've been studying Hobbes, that wouldn't be sufficient for what Aristotle means as civic friendship. It can't, self-interest is not enough. Even though Aristotle followed Plato in claiming that the polis must be of limited geographic extent and encompass a small population in order for civic friendship to be possible, he disagreed with Plato's conception of that friendship. In Aristotle's view, the polis is not small enough for all of the citizens to be intimate friends with each other. In fact, it's too large for all of them to know each other well or to spend substantial time together, which is the basis of character friendships or personal friendships. You have to, Aristotle says, spend time with your friends. It's interesting to think today how that the new means of communication may have changed that to some extent, because we're able to spend time with friends that's not face-to-face. In fact, thus the kind of civic friendship Aristotle promoted was less tight, less based on family than that discussed by Plato. Nevertheless, Aristotle believed that civic friendship is genuine friendship. Given that security is the most fundamental aim of the political order, civic friendship necessarily has a component of usefulness and advantage. Sure, common sense. But it also entails concord, Aristotle said. And he wrote this, quote, "Concord also appears to be a mark of friendship. Thus it is not merely identity of opinion, homodoxia, for this might occur even among people who do not know each other." People can agree without knowing each other. They might not even know that they agree. Nor do we say that people are in concord when they agree about just anything. But we say a city is in concord when its citizens agree about what is advantageous, choose the same actions, and act on what they have resolved to do in common, unquote. Thus, for Aristotle, civic friendship involves sharing a common opinion, though the mere identity of opinion, as I quoted, is not sufficient grounds for this or for any other kind of friendship. The shared opinion among citizens must be of the sort that involves agreement and about what is advantageous and just, which in turn comprises the basis for public and mutual public decisions and actions. It should be noted that the kind of agreement that constitutes civic concord for Aristotle does not require people to think completely alike or to have identical opinions, passions, or interests. Rather, they retain their individuality and diverse views, which enables them to deliberate on political matters. There can't be deliberation unless there are ideas that come together, that it's not just people repeating what each other have been saying. Nonetheless, they do share in a common basic view of justice. And in this sense, Aristotle says they are, quote, of the same mind, unquote, which he calls the best antidote for stasis or faction. The very best antidote for faction, for the kind of things that rip a polity apart, are to come together in agreement on the most fundamental of things. Furthermore, according to Aristotle, not all civic friendships are alike. There are two main kinds, one grounded in legal considerations and the other in moral. The first is based on agreement and the second on trust. Friendship based on legal considerations is relatively straightforward. It constitutes a legal bond among the members of the community, which results from a contract, social contract, and subsequently framed laws. You'll see this in Hobbes that you're studying in class. This is the kind of connection one finds in the social contract theory of the early modern thinkers such as Hobbes and Rousseau. I anticipated myself. It is also the basis for the argument the laws pronounce in a booming voice in Plato's Crito. Self-preservation, self-interest, and obedience to the law are the key factors here. For Aristotle, the relationship among citizens or political orders, citizens of political orders based merely on usefulness and self-advantage, just like the relations between people based on mere utility, do not fulfill the requirements of genuine friendship, whether civic or personal, and thus are only very loosely referred to as such. So in other words, two business people who say, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and they get things done, they make things happen. It's a friendship based on usefulness or self-interest, and we loosely call it that, but we know we're speaking loosely. It's not a true, genuine friendship that has to do with love and respect for the other's character. And respect to civic friendship grounded in moral considerations, citizens are bound together by more than just contracts and laws. They are inspired by a concern for their polity and its way of life. and by goodwill towards the members of their city. And by city here, I'm using this in the Greek sense of political order. They are not only concerned with their own security and economic well-being, but are attentive to the moral views and ethical views and character of their fellow citizens. This is what the ancients considered the basis of a true polity, or a republic. For Aristotle, then, to be citizens of a genuine polity, the people do not all have to know each other intimately, or even personally. However, for there to be civic friendship in any meaningful sense, the citizens do have to possess knowledge of the political opinions and moral character of each other, and care for their mutual improvement. In addition, they must deliberate together and act in common. To achieve this, Aristotle taught, they must live together in one location, participate in public festivals and institutions together, provide for a common defense, undergo a common education, and intermarry. For these reasons, Aristotle argued that the polis had to be small in size and limited in population. So, this is all well and good for the ancients, but we live in a very different world today. Different politically, different geographically, technologically, economically, religiously, and culturally. Cognizant that the world had changed immensely from ancient times to our own, Montesquieu believed that the classical notion of citizenship, based on virtue and concord, was no longer possible in the modern world. This is true for all regime types, Montesquieu taught, including republics. In the modern republic, he said, commerce is paramount, and connections between citizens are principally based on economic utility or self-interest. Du commerce, or the soft, gentle, cordial manners produced by following the unwritten rules of self-interest, which everyone knows. While it unites nations, he said, it does not unite individuals. According to Montesquieu, civic discord rather than civic friendship characterizes the modern republic. The politics of conflict, as in the British party system of opposition politics, as evident also in the institution of separation of powers and checks and balances, and in the jealousy and distrust that accompanies these kinds of institutional and rival arrangements. Montesquieu says is beneficial to the stability and equilibrium of a nation. So civic concord is a good thing. Let's take advantage of it, Montesquieu says. Now, Rousseau disagreed with this. He thought it was a commercial bourgeois perspective on politics, and he attempted to recreate the homogeneity of the polis and the sentimental bonds of citizenship in the modern world. James Madison viewed Rousseau's approach as akin to theoretic politics, which he didn't mention as a compliment, and instead accepted Montesquieu's practical stance on representation, separation of powers, institutional checks and balances, and economic diversification. Madison did not, however, accept Montesquieu's conflict model of politics as a substitute for uniting civic principle. I want to emphasize that because Madison in many ways has been called the father of the Constitution. And of course in the Federalist Papers, he writes those essays that describe the Republican, small r Republican character that he thinks informs the United States Constitution. He says no other form of government would be reconcilable with the genius of the American people, with the fundamental principles of the Revolution, or with that spirit of freedom that animates every votary of freedom. So Madison's going to agree with Montesquieu about separation of powers, checks and balances, and let these kind of rival groups, let interest counteract interest, ambition counteract ambition. All well and good. But he doesn't think, at least in my study and reading of Madison, he doesn't think the American Constitution and way of life is built on the idea of just substituting those things for civic unity. Madison saw the idea of an equilibrium in the passions and interests within the society, not merely as a way to prevent any one particular class or interest from concentrating power, though he did view this as one of diversity's beneficial attributes. He also envisioned this societal equilibrium to serve as an environment in which public opinion can be effectively formed, refined, and enlarged to provide the key stabilizing and uniting element of the political order. Accordingly, unlike Montesquieu, who did not define the modern republic in terms of a substantive conception of justice held in common by the citizenry, Madison reclaimed the classical idea that each regime has a predominant view of justice that defines the association and its members. For Montesquieu, there could be, he says it's important, it's not important what the people reason about, it's just important that they reason, that they have opinions and put demands on, so conflict will occur that creates a kind of equilibrium. Madison thinks what those opinions are, what we reason about, matter. So Madison parted ways from the classics, however, in limiting the size of a republic to a small territory. Those of you who studied Federalist 10 are very familiar with his idea of the large republic argument, right? That he's going to disagree with the classics that a republic can only work in a small territory. He says it can work in a large territory, a territory as big as 13 states, or even more, because they're already looking at Western expansion. Remember, those 13 states also include what are today Maine, right? Because that's part of Massachusetts, and Vermont, which was part of New York. And they're already looking to the Ohio Valley and beyond. So Madison envisioned a large republic composed of citizens united by, and these are his words, one harmonious interest and common cause, regardless of circumstantial and artificial distinctions that characterize an extensive commercial society. What was Madison thinking? Is it desirable, is it even possible for there to be a common conception of justice and a common cause in a large modern commercial republic constituted by so much multiplicity and diversity of interests, religions, and views? Is it possible? Is it desirable? Madison's understanding of the dawn of the commercial age encompassed more than the increased trade and prosperity resulting from improvements in navigation and trade in modern times, and travel in modern times. This was one aspect of modern commerce, trade, travel. Another aspect entailed the improvements in communication, which made possible not just the exchange of goods, but the exchange of ideas over a large geographic area, or what Madison called, quote, the commerce of ideas, unquote. Both of these developments resulted from discoveries in modern science, including the invention of the compass and the printing press. Madison believed that the advances in communication that emerged in the 18th century, evident in the enormous increase in the print industry and the rise of newspapers, broadsides, and magazines, marked a critical juncture in politics. He thought something had changed historically that offered a new possibility in politics, one that the classics couldn't see because they didn't have those kind of historical circumstances that enabled people to communicate over a larger swath of territory. The classics had to have a small territory because you had to meet in one place in the assembly. And it's the print industry that changes the possibility of communicating much more broadly and afar. These developments made possible the rescue of Republican government from the diseases to which it had historically been so prone, and offered new grounds of hope for achieving success in the great experiment in self-government. In Madison's view, the commerce of ideas and politics of public opinion meant that an extensive territory composed of millions of Republican souls could form one people. Not 5,040, as Plato said, but millions. But this would require a well-constructed political system that promoted a general harmony in the interests and affections of the great body of the people. And those are Madison's words. Now, to grasp what James Madison was about, I think it's crucial to understand that he was not a pluralist, as that term is generally understood in political science. He enthusiastically welcomed a diversity of economic interests, occupations, and religions, and he was an avid defender of the freedom of conscience, speech, and press. After all, he authored the First Amendment. Nonetheless, he hoped that the expression of different opinions would, via the deliberative constitutional and political processes that he helped to design, result in a consensus of the society on the most fundamental political and moral issues. Not on everything, but on the most fundamental of them. Indeed, following the classics, he believed that such a consensus is necessary for the preservation and continuation of the political order. Now, we recall that Aristotle toned down Plato's conception of civic friendship, defining it as concord between fellow citizens, rather than that rare species of friendship that's between best friends or in families. And while citizens did not all have to know each other personally, still, they did have to live in a small polis in order to know about each other's views and moral character, and to care for each other in any meaningful sense. In the 17th and 18th centuries, as Montesquieu, Hume, Gibbon, and others noted, various technological and political changes made larger states the rule rather than the exception, thereby making the small polity a vestige of the past. That happened before America. In Madison's mind, however, these same advances in science, technology, and commerce also made possible a communication throughout a vast territory. They supplied the communicative tools that for the first time in the history of the world allowed for the formation of a public. This is a new idea, the idea of a public. Allowed for the formation of a public that was more than a small cadre of citizens meeting face to face in the ecclesia. The French noted the power of this new phenomena in the years leading up to their revolution. Madison also noted that the new and improved means of travel and communication changed the idea of what constitutes a practicable sphere in politics, radically altering the notion that only in a small polity could a people govern themselves. Improvements such as, and I quote Madison here, good roads, domestic commerce, a free press, and particularly a circulation of newspapers throughout the entire body of the people, and representatives going from and returning to every part of them, are equivalents to a contraction of the territorial limits and favorable to liberty, where these boundaries may be too extensive, unquote. So he's talking about the size of the territory. He can be big, but it can't be too big. It has to be what he says is practicable. Why? Because communication has to be possible among the people to keep their eyes on the government. If it's too large, the public voice is silenced, and government can be run away into despotism. How large can it be? Well, things that react against the territorial size are things that increase communication and travel. Canals, roads, newspapers, Pony Express, and just imagine what that's going to mean in our day. So in essence, the old notion that a large territory is an invitation to despotism because the people cannot communicate and unite to defend their liberties must be rethought, Madison said, in a new age of communication. So too the idea that a republic must be confined to a small territory in order for the citizens to effectively communicate, deliberate, and act in common. This is precisely what Madison did. He revisited the issue of a size of a republic, reconfiguring the factor of territorial size vis-a-vis the ability of citizens to communicate their views and to deliberate on political matters. Now, the famous theory of the extended republic attributed to Madison is indeed a unique and critical insight. But it is, in my view at least, perhaps less exceptional due to its proffered cure for majority faction that he finds by way of a multiplicity of economic interests and religious identities, and more for its novel treatment of the prospects for Republican government in a new age of communication. When Madison's looking at the history of Republican popular governments throughout history, and Hamilton says the same thing, they've never worked. It's a history of failure. While there might be momentary rays of glory that break forth from the gloom, Hamilton says in Federalist 9, they sort of tease us, and then it ends in failure. Primarily because of the problem of faction. that people can communicate too easily, and passions and self-interest and prejudices can spread so easily that there isn't sufficient deliberation and justice is sacrificed. One group oppresses the other. So Madison, however, believes he discovered a political design conducive to the fair trial of self-government and the practice of civic friendship in the modern world. Well, a large population of citizens spread over an extensive territory will certainly not know each other personally. Because of the improved means of communication, they can in fact know each other's views and characters, and they are capable of engaging in deliberative politics, of forming a public opinion, and through representatives of acting in common. They have it in their power not only to exercise a defensive watchfulness against governmental usurpations, but in fact to form a common cause, even civic affection, despite the differences that separate them geographically, economically, or religiously. Here are Madison's words. Let us eradicate local prejudices and mistaken rivalships to consolidate the affairs of the states into one harmonious interest, and let it be the patriotic study of all, to erect over the whole one paramount empire of reason, benevolence, and brotherly affection. That's Madison. Now, fast forward 2 centuries. In our society today, modes, speed, ease of communication have burgeoned beyond the wildest imagination of the founding generation. The internet and what it spawned, email, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, have revolutionized communications not only in our country, but across the face of the globe. The size and population of the United States has increased in 100-fold. It's 3.5 million then, close to 350 million today. But at the same time, advances in communications technology seem to have outstripped geographical and demographic growth. Is political communication too fast and facile today? I was talking with students this afternoon who were telling me about how that in fact happens a lot for the young generation when they post something, that it instantly, people react to it instantly and oftentimes not in a deliberative way. Is it too easy for people to communicate and unite on the basis of partial interest and prejudice, which was the problem of faction that Madison set himself about to solve? Has this become a problem, especially due to the bubble and echo chamber phenomena that have emerged in recent years, in which many people tend to limit their news sources and dialogues to those with whom they already agree? Despite the large size of the country and its numerous population, has the warp speed spread of passion, prejudice, and thoughtless ideology broken down the buttresses of the deliberative processes? Is this part of the reason that the nation today is so ideologically fragmented? As we're all well aware, the nation is not only fractured today, but it's essentially split into 2 camps along partisan and ideological lines. Has communications technology, in a sense, recreated the problem of the small republic, in which the society can easily divide into a majority and minority faction based on numbers, who instead of listening to and attempting to accommodate one another, engage in the kind of factional, oppressive politics once so characteristic of the small republic? There's some evidence which seems to indicate that the revolution in communications technology has not only promoted public deliberation in America and throughout the world, but has perhaps contributed to the narrowing of viewpoints and divisions, actually narrowing and dividing society even more. And a study conducted by Pew, for example, the effects of social media on polarization are shown by the fact that 27% of people surveyed either blocked or unfriended someone because of a political disagreement or something they found offensive on social media. 27%. The current deep and volatile fragmentation in our nation today raises the following question. Have the tremendous advances in technology and the ease and rapidity of communications disturbed the balance of Madison's practicable sphere, such that the United States has become a large republic susceptible to the problem of faction? If Madison turned the classics on their head in his analysis of faction, has communication technology today, our situation, turned Madison's analysis on its head? And what is the nature of this political face-off? Is it rough and tumble politics as usual, nothing too serious to worry about? Or are we so markedly diverse, fractured, and factionalized in our political and ethical views and in our loves and hates that the old civic bonds that once held Americans together are too tattered and too worn to stave off the gloomy prospect of discord and disintegration? Are the mystic chords of memory too faded, too weak to preserve us as one people? Now, this analysis points to two critical questions facing us today. One process-oriented, the other substantively oriented. First, the substantive question. In an era that holds diversity in high esteem, is civic friendship desirable to us today? Is civic concord something we still strive for? If not, we must ask ourselves if any political order ever did or ever could sustain itself in the absence of a shared fundamental commitment to a common cause. If we still do strive for public concord, the procedural question arises. Can an effective deliberative politics, which is essential to civic friendship, be achieved in the political and technological world in which we live? Are the means to achieve this at our disposal? Do we have to think anew how to use the means that are presently available to us? Or has the social and political world changed so much that in our present age, the means simply do not exist to accomplish the political task? Are we in a predicament, much like the classics were, which had to wait the modern era to discover that for which, and I quote Madison, because this is what he thinks he discovered, that for which philosophy has been searching and humanity been sighing from the most remote ages? He said this is what we had discovered in America. This challenge presents itself to students of politics today. It is also the challenge that conscientious citizens will take up. But let me reiterate that this is a procedural question and challenge, and that no procedures can succeed in rescuing popular government in and of themselves. The central idea of the citizens, their fundamental opinions about what is just and unjust, right and wrong, ultimately determine the character of free government. And further, no government by the people can long endure, whose citizens have nothing in common but a dislike for one another. In words you have heard before, let us remember another time when we were called upon to do the work of citizens. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Thank you.
All right, time for questions. If you would talk into the mic when you ask your question, then you'll be picked up on the audio feed, and then, of course, we make these videos available, and so you'll be heard on the video version of this. Thank you.
One of the themes that you return to again and again is the importance of a common conception of justice, which is an interesting concept given the current conflict involving Kavanaugh. One of the striking moments in that debate or whatever to me was Senator Gillibrand saying the burden of proof is on Kavanaugh to prove his innocence, which is such a reversal of innocent until proven guilty, and represents certainly a different conception of justice, I think, from many, including myself. And I wonder if you would comment on that.
Oh, that's a great and a difficult question, isn't it? Yeah, I saw the tapes of her saying that. That's the question of procedural justice. Innocent until proven guilty. How we go about this, in the United States, and of course it's part of an old tradition, an English tradition. I hope that we haven't given up on that, anyone, no matter where we stand, because whether the Supreme Court nominee is a Trump nominee or an Obama nominee, or for anybody for that matter, and I don't think you have to be in a court for this to hold true, that we probably should presume people innocent unless we have good evidence otherwise, because we live in an age in politics in which accusations themselves sometimes count for guilt. And it's a ruination of character. And what do we own that's really more precious to us than our character, our reputation? So I think that would be a huge loss if we went down that route. And I suspect that, honestly, most people on both sides of the aisle don't like the idea of assuming people guilty before we have evidence, but that what's going on in this case is the passions are so heated, that each side wants to win so badly, that people are willing on both sides to turn their eyes sometimes to all the political processes that we go through, because they want to get this over with and they want to decide it the way they think is best decided. We're letting the ends justify the means, and that's always a danger. Now, the ends don't justify the means, but it's also the case that nothing else but the ends can ever justify the means. So that question of justice and what will ultimately happen in the United States, not only based on the court rulings, but politics in general, that's what I think some of this fight is really about. It's really about the future of the country, much more than simply about Kavanaugh. That's my read.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was curious what your commentary would be if Madison were to see the deterioration of intermediary institutions, both in political participation and economic participation, what he would have to say about that.
So intermediary institutions like voluntary associations like Tocqueville talked about, yeah, I think he'd be very concerned. In fact, he speaks to this point to some extent in a little essay called Consolidation. And it's online, you can find it. It's an op-ed. It's amazing what they put in, the kind of thought they put into some of these, 1- and 2-page op-eds that were published in the newspapers. But he says that the problem is, in a large country, if you don't have these state and local entities, and by local he's talking about these kind of voluntary associations, he said that there's a real problem there because then you're leaving the central government to a self-directed course. Because the public voice will be silenced if you don't have these organs that are necessary to develop and communicate and to form public opinion that we do through local organizations and the way we participate with our neighbors. Alex and I were talking about this earlier, and Alex brought up a really interesting point about this, that maybe some of that disintegration at the local level is part of the reason for this fragmentation. What if we work together more at the local level, we're forced to see more people of different parties for human beings, as opposed to simply as a label. And we're losing some of that ability to do that. And so I think for Madison, federalism is not like it was for Calhoun, just states' rights. It's very much an integral part of how this whole idea of forming public opinion can work, so that public opinion becomes not just the passions of the public, but what he calls the reason of the public, a deliberative opinion that comes from this discourse. There's a reason the process in the United States is so slow and difficult to get any kind of legislation through. Madison would say, good, because that slowing it down is there for a reason. All along these points is supposed to be this communicative process between citizens, whether it's in op-eds and newspapers, in salons and pubs, at universities and classes, between representatives and the people, and then the representatives go to Congress, and between and among them, and then between the two houses of Congress, and then between them and the presidency, and then between the presidency and the people. So all of these points are supposed to be points of deliberation that take time, take energy, and it takes not only talking but listening to your neighbors. And that's the process that you can't shortcut it. That's required in order for a kind of public opinion that he thinks is worthy of ruling in a free government takes place. And federalism is critical to that process in a large country. And it has to do not just with states' rights, but with that there's got to be these different levels of where things are decided, and participation that's really at all these levels. Because the larger you get, he's afraid that people are going to feel insignificant in their own eyes. So one of the ways to counteract that is through voluntary associations and local kinds of voluntary associations. Thanks, Laura. Yes.
First, I'd like to thank you for that wonderful phrase, mystical bonds of memory. I'm going to use that, and I will credit you. I'm thinking about some of the...
And I should have cited.
Oh.
I should have cited Abraham Lincoln.
Well, you're a good company. I'm thinking about the deep divisions in America to which you spoke, this hyper-polarization, and some of the recent political science, social science research that I've read that indicates that out-group animosity is actually more important, more consequential for identifying in-group affinity than actual warmth or identity with your in-group. In other words, how do we know you're one of us? Because you hate the right people. So with that recognition, and I think the way the audience reacted here was sort of an aha, like we get that. How do we overcome that? And how do the classical authors speak to that issue?
Well, I'll try to answer that really good and very difficult question, but the easiest way to unite people is by having a common enemy.
Right.
That's easy. And so that's why sometimes despots go to war, because it's the easiest way to get them off of your back and united behind you. I mean, this is the whole history of the world shows this. So that's easy. I remember after 9/11, and the country came together. There were those days following 9/11 where we seemed to be so united as a people. We all, and there was a pride once again, not only in our country, but in what we stood for. We weren't defining it, but somehow people knew. And we spoke as one. And shortly after that, I was on an accreditation committee with Amy Cass, and that night we all had dinner together, the group of us, and her husband came along, Leon Cass, who happens to be a very interesting human being. He's at the University of Chicago, and if you don't know of him, look him up. He's an incredibly thoughtful human being. One of the icons in terms of true scholars of our day, and thoughtful. And I happened to be sitting right next to him at dinner, and we were talking about that, and how there was such unity, and he said, but I fear. I said, that's easy. That's the easy part. You see, that's a common enemy. The question is there something not that we're against, but something that we're all for? And that's where we are today. I don't think we know what that is. That's what we're fighting about. It's not the first time in our history when this has happened, though. And we've gotten over it before.
Are you thinking the 1860s?
Well, sure. But there might be other times too, maybe not as bad as that, but the 1790s, it was very critical. Jefferson was, there were people talking about seceding. Aaron Burr was talking about establishing, another union of the northeastern states. Jefferson is so on the brink of thinking this with the Alien Sedition Acts when he writes the Kentucky resolutions. He's really talking about nullifying national law. Now, Madison's trying to pull him back. But Jefferson gave Calhoun ammunition for his arguments later on in the Kentucky, and he thinks, he's all but think we've lost it. So he's right next door to write a revolution. And then he gets elected president, and he says, oh, it's not as bad as I thought it was. We're all Republicans, we're all Democrats. We can bond together, we can heal. And it's not just that he himself gets elected, but he thinks that we've gotten over that hump of, that he and Madison thinks it's very dire then too. The Sedition Acts, shutting down free speech. If we don't have free speech, so many of our other freedoms depend on that. Well, today we're facing some of that again, right? There are speech wars on college campuses. How long will it take that this gets even more into the general public? Because that's usually how things work. So we'll see. But I'm hoping by addressing this kind of issue, especially, with all of us, and then with people like Laura and others, that maybe they'll work on these things, because we have work to do right now before it gets too dire. Because it is serious right now, I think. I think it's very serious. But I don't think it's a lost cause.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your comments. They're really, really interesting. And I'm glad to hear you say that there's hope, because I live in a small town, and I have a lot of people that have very different political views than I do, but we also have children who go to the same schools, and we go to the same coffee shop, and we read the same newspaper, and so we can have conversations even though we know we're dialectically opposed, because there's something other than just your political opinion there. But I'm wondering what you think about, would Madison see social media and the way that it's used to communicate with political issues as an incubator of factions?
Yeah. Sure. I think it can go both ways, can it? See, he saw this whole question of communication, the same with newspapers, right? In his time, that would have been the newspapers. It's different. But it certainly did actually, when the Capitol was first in Philadelphia, before it gets moved to the Potomac, he and Hamilton worked side by side on the Federalist Papers to ratify the Constitution. 4 years later, they are on opposite sides, the founders of the first political parties of America. Hamilton on one side, Madison and Jefferson on the other. And they are fighting this out in the newspapers. And there's a newspaper that loves Hamilton and his policies, because Hamilton's leading the charge from the Treasury Department, called the Gazette of the United States. So Jefferson takes on a clerk, part-time, this Frenchman, Philip Freneau, in Department of State. And on the side, Philip Freneau establishes a newspaper called the National Gazette. And these are partisan, and they're representing the Republican cause. So this is not new, and they are fighting back and forth, back and forth. Hamilton's writing, Madison's writing. Jefferson's not really writing. He's saying, Madison, pick up your pen. And so, see, that kind of communication can increase the partisan spirit. It can also be a source of discourse and deliberation. if there's any listening going on. It's a double-edged sword, communication, because you've got to communicate to agree and you've got to communicate to disagree. So, but you have to let the disagreements happen and still be willing to listen. And I think that's more the problem today than well, I don't want to say more of a problem than the disagreements themselves, because the disagreements are serious. But in a sense, look, what are we fighting over? I think what we're fighting over is whether we still hold these truths of the Declaration of Independence. That we not only have rights, but we have responsibilities to each other. To recognize others as human beings and to treat them as such. What does that mean? What does it mean to be human? Do we have any ways of, can it be anything and everything we want it to be? That anything we want and we desire as a right is a right? Or are there certain limitations that if we go beyond those kinds of boundaries, we're undermining our humanity? So we're fighting over those things. And I don't know where it's going to lead. But what I am pretty sure of is right now the sides are not wanting to listen too much to each other. And what Bob is doing here with his program at Colorado is saying, let's talk about these things. And that if the university can't do that, if we can't do that in the university, then where's it going to happen? And every university has to do it. Even the ones that are most known for a particular point of view, whether it's Berkeley or Hillsdale, has to be done. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to ask one question, but that's okay. I can get it back. I'll get it back. Ladies first.
Thanks so much for being here. I actually invited a friend to the Candace Owens event last night who is not of this room's leanings. And he didn't burst into flames, and he was very kind and patient for sticking around. But when I got into a conversation with him that was pretty extensive afterwards, and we were talking about different issues, I noticed that the difference was we don't come from the same amount of information. So there are some issues, whether it happens to be what exactly, you mentioned echo chambers, and you mentioned also Islamophobia, but how do you talk Islamophobia with somebody who doesn't know what taqiyya is, or abrogation, or what Sharia law is? How do you have that conversation? How do you talk to somebody who is a professor or a teacher who doesn't know what Common Core is and what drives that? How do you talk to somebody about Agenda 21 when they don't understand, they've never even heard of it? So when you have these factions that are out there that aren't common knowledge, and believe me, I didn't, and I've learned about these things over the years, and it's taken time and an actual interest, and yet you have an apathetic public, that I'm generalizing, I'm so broad brushing, but when you don't have these opportunities to get together, and we're not all in college anymore, so we don't have these open discussions, so how does the general population have any access to this one? They don't even know what they don't know, like Reagan said.
Can I just turn the question on you, hold on to that for a minute? Because obviously this is something you've thought about a little bit. How did you deal with that with your friend?
Well, this is someone that is new in my world in the last month or so, and if I vomit all of this information on him, he will run away in 2 seconds. So I know that in the real world, sometimes you have to choose to be loved, and sometimes you have to choose to be right. And so trying to spoon feed him and begging him after he turned me down to show up last night, but I kind of stayed on him and said I wouldn't invite you to something that you wouldn't enjoy and get something out of.
But he hated it.
No.
Oh.
He just refused to do it because he was freaked out before.
He didn't go.
He did come.
Oh, he did.
But he refused. He turned me down twice before I asked
But
the third
he came.
time. Yeah. I'm in sales, I do what I can do. So, it's a matter of persuasion, but you can't, and I teased him about, well, you didn't burst into flames, right? And he didn't clap once. And so it was just, I'm sure he just felt like he was in enemy territory and on pins and needles. So I tried to just be as quiet as I could and tried not to clap too crazily and too frequently.
Was there anything that he might have said that he disagreed with about the talk that you thought maybe he has something there, maybe there's something there?
I didn't want to quiz him, and I didn't want to have him justify.
But does he have any opinions that are contrary to yours that you think, well, maybe he's got something there, that it's worth it for me to listen?
Well, and that's my point. It's the echo chamber situation where he's a union guy. He's got family who were teachers. He's a railroad guy. Everything that he's ever known has been paid for by the government. And for me to try and bring in just generalities, rule of law, and individual responsibility, and limited government.
Rome's not built in a day. Yeah. It's funny in book 1 of Plato's Republic, and Bob's the expert in this, but when Polemachus orders his slave boy to run after Socrates and order him to stay, and they catch up, and Socrates is there with Glaucon, and Socrates says, well, isn't there anything can I persuade you? And Polemachus says, what? Not if we don't listen. Do you see how many of us are? Not if we don't listen. Well, no, but the listening has to go both ways, right? And I think a huge dose of humility for all of us, that maybe some things we know, but we have to constantly put our own ideas to the test, even when we studied something a long time, because we might not have it right. There might be somebody who's actually got something to say that we can learn from. And I think in engaging in that kind of, with that kind of spirit, that it's a two-way street is the start. Polemachus didn't want it to be a two-way street. It became a two-way street eventually in the Republic, but it's not clear how it's resolved, if it's resolved by persuasion or power, ballots or bullets. But what we're hoping, right, is that the gentle, unassuming voice of persuasion is the one that we can employ. But to do that, we have to act that part ourselves, I think. This gentleman, and then...
Well, you mentioned it several times, this notion of a common sense of justice that is shared. That's part of what makes the whole thing work. I think that where we started out 230 years ago was with the notion of the primacy of the individual, and that everything was structured around protecting the individual. And now we have gone over the course of time. That's seldom the conversation anymore. Because now
you're talking about identity,
you don't have
identity politics.
Yeah. So the country was organized around that notion, and part of the friction is that the structure is based on the individual. And there are those who think that the way the country ought to be run is based on whatever in any group has some desire, need, or want.
Well...
That's a question. I mean, is that the source of the friction today?
Yes. Yeah, if what you're referring to is tribalism, yeah, it's a problem. We have a lot of work to do. Yeah. But show me any tribe in which there aren't members who disagree. And, and we just have to take those things seriously. And it's going to be a tough one to get over, but it might be a little bit of a fad, because that is not actually going on in all Western democracies. A lot of these things that are going on in the United States are going on in Europe. I talked to a friend of mine in France not too long ago, and he says, "Oh, you people are ridiculous. We don't have any of that there, any of that here." So that particular symptom is not one that seems to be part of that, part of the breakdown of liberal democracies in the West today. So we'll see. That could be a little bit of a fad. We'll see. I don't know, but needs to be addressed, absolutely, because for all kinds of reasons that it's, I think, I don't think groups have rights per se. I don't see how that makes sense. Not as a group per se, yeah. But if they do, then why not the majority have the biggest right and just leave it at that? That means that we don't check the majority, right?
Well, that's the whole essence of what we set up.
Or we let the minorities, all the minorities have rights, and then all we have is a Calhoun concurrent majority system, and it just becomes tribalism. So I don't think it works very well. And I think we're seeing that it doesn't, but that's going to take some work because it's very popular right now. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I presume that you don't identify despotism with appeal to popular opinion, and yet you twice colluded or said those in the same phrase. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, well, that's precisely Madison's question. How to have public opinion, which for all practical intents and purposes, he says, is the opinion of the majority, because we don't usually have unanimity. How do we have rule by public opinion, majority opinion, and at the same time have just majority rule? He puts the question this way. He says, in smaller Republican government, it's presumed that power and right, by which he means justice, power and right are on the same side. The problem is in practice, it's not always. You know, there was a majority who enslaved a minority in the United States for many years. And he actually talks about that as the very antithesis of what he's talking about here, the problem. He talks about that as the problem. And so, I mean, that's precisely the problem. How do you get public opinion to be just public opinion so it's not tyrannical, not the tyranny of the majority? Tocqueville later saw that too, right? Because your choices are these. Either find a way, as difficult as it might be, to make that happen, which might include all kinds of institutions, separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, bicameralism, but at bottom, some kind of refinement and elevation of the public views, some kind of a civic education, because your only other choice is some form of minority rule. Those are your choices.
You mentioned a lot with the various classical philosophers talking about when there's a lack of a common value or common, I guess, idea for people to strive for, that's a problem. And you also mentioned that how that's currently happening today. So I'm kind of wondering, when after the creation of the United States, has there been like a very strong common value or common good that's not based around a common enemy?
Well, you know, we just had someone lecture at my home institution, Villanova, just the other day, who's written a book called Shattered Consensus. And the author's name is Jim Pearson. And his argument is that we came out of the wars in the 20th century with a consensus that then becomes shattered. He thought that was probably the strongest period in America, in which, you know, we'd already fought a war, and then we'd come together. Before that started breaking down again. I actually think after the election of Jefferson too, that there was fairly good, solid consensus in the country. You can say, well, what about the problem of slavery? Well, I agree. But interestingly enough, even the people who owned slaves, they called it a necessary evil. They thought it was wrong. And so, even though they called it necessary, the noun was evil. And so that meant it had to be gotten rid of as fast and as well as circumstances would permit. And slavery was on the course of ultimate extinction. You can see all kinds of legislation going in that direction. When Calhoun starts writing and arguing in the late 1830s, 1840s, that's a positive good, that's when it starts to change again. And this and the what the country stands for is, Calhoun says that the Declaration of Independence is a self-evident, that all men are created equal is a self-evident lie. You know, and so you can see that consensus is breaking apart. And so that's why Lincoln asks, right, in the House of, whither are we tending? You know, as long as we've got to be moving, you can't do everything in one day. That's not, politics requires some kind of prudence because, you know, you have to be careful not to let the best become the enemy of the good, right? It's not, politics isn't philosophy. It's not just theory. So that direction, that tendency that we're going in, which is the tendency ultimately of public opinion, what we believe in, because what we believe, our ideas matter and will lead us in one way or another in a particular direction. That's what we're fighting over. Things will happen based on the ideas that are being debated today and whether or not we're persuading each other of what we ought to be standing for. Thank you very much for that question.
Thanks to all of you for your questions. Let's thank Professor Sheehan one more time.